Raymond Cole was 54 when he realized his body was paying a price his mind had ignored for decades. From the outside, his life seemed orderly: a commercial real estate developer in Denver, a spacious house, 2 grown children, a successful wife, and a routine that fit perfectly into what people usually call stability. But inside, Raymond was exhausted. It wasn't physical fatigue, it was a constant silent wear and tear, accumulating year after year. He lived measuring his gestures, words, and silences, trying not to provoke new criticism, new comparisons, new demands. Every morning he woke with a pressure in his chest that he couldn't explain, as if his own body anticipated that day, once again, nothing he did would be enough. Catherine, his wife, had transformed their marriage into a permanent showcase. Everything had to look impeccable: the house, the trips, the friendships, the photos, the family's public image. Raymond wasn't a partner. He was part of the scenery. If something didn't shine brightly enough, if someone else had something better, more expensive, or more eye-catching, the comparison was immediate. Never in the form of loud shouts, but as constant reproaches, disappointed glances, comments that seemed small but accumulated like stones. Raymond fulfilled all his obligations: work, bills, presents, support. Even so, he was always cold, distant, insufficient. Over time, he stopped explaining how he felt because every attempt backfired, as if expressing weariness were an unforgivable offense. The day everything changed seemed unremarkable at first. It was an ordinary morning, with the same dry Denver sky and the same accumulated sense of routine. Raymond left early, checked emails, spoke with a contractor, and resolved a minor issue at a construction site. Nothing out of the ordinary. What was strange was his body. A persistent fatigue, a nagging pressure in his chest, a cold sweat that appeared without warning. He tried to ignore it, as he had ignored so many other signs over the years. But this time it didn't work. The pain became clearer, more defined, and for the first time, Raymond felt real fear. Not abstract fear, but that concrete fear of thinking that something was truly wrong. That it wasn't just ordinary stress, not just emotional exhaustion. At the hospital, while the doctors discussed a mild heart attack and accumulated stress, Catherine didn't slow down. She was there, physically present, but mentally elsewhere. She was on the phone, complaining about delays, grumbling about the uncomfortable environment, asking how long all this was going to last. Raymond listened from the gurney, still dazed, and it was then that something settled inside him. There was no anger or argument. There was clarity. He understood that she could die right there, and that nothing, absolutely nothing, was going to stop the life she was living. There would be no pause, no reflection, no caring. That was the real impact. Not the heart attack, but the certainty that her future absence wouldn't change anyone's rhythm. After being discharged, Raymond returned home with a list of medical recommendations that emphasized reducing stress, changing habits, and resting. In practice, nothing changed around him. The house continued to function as a showcase. The demands persisted, and conversations revolved around events, image, and money. Raymond began to observe silently. He didn't argue. He didn't confront. He didn't try to explain himself. Inside, something had shifted. He was no longer seeking approval or expecting understanding. He was evaluating. Every comment, every unnecessary expense, every impulsive decision began to fit together like pieces of a puzzle. There was no love, no mutual care, only performance. And he had maintained that structure for years, even at the cost of his own health. That's when he made a decision, one that was neither dramatic nor publicized. Raymond wasn't going to. explode. He wasn't going to scream. He wasn't going to fight for crumbs of recognition. If he was going to leave, it would be with a cool head. He began reviewing old contracts, properties, loans, legal structures he himself had once crafted for clients. He did it at night, silently, while the house slept. He wasn't seeking revenge. He was seeking balance. He wanted to leave alive, physically and emotionally. And he understood something important. If he left impulsively, he would be destroyed in the narrative. If he left strategically, he could disappear without a sound, and for the first time in decades, breathe without feeling he had to prove anything to anyone. For the next few months, Raymond led a silent, double life. By day, he continued to fulfill expectations, meetings, calls, minimal social events, the same old image. By night, he orchestrated his departure with the precision of someone who had spent years solving complex problems. He restructured properties, adjusted debts, and surgically separated assets. Nothing illegal, nothing improvised. Every move had technical backing and financial sense. Some of the most visible assets would remain untouched, but tied to obligations that weren't immediately apparent. Raymond knew that Catherine was driven by appearances, not substance, and he designed everything with that in mind, to leave her with what glittered and to imbue that glitter with real weight. In that process, Olivia began to occupy a key role, though without any drama. She had always seen clearly what others preferred to ignore. An investigative journalist, accustomed to reading between the lines, she quickly understood that her father wasn't running away. He was surviving. Raymond created a discreet, solid trust with clear rules and real control, and left Olivia in charge. There were no emotional speeches or grandiose promises. It was a brief, direct, almost technical conversation. Olivia didn't need many details. She knew that this move wasn't against her mother, but in favor of her father's life, and she respected the silence, understanding that sometimes protecting also means not interfering. The day Raymond decided to leave, there was no argument, no scene. He prepared everything with the same calm he had learned to use to restrain himself for years. He left the divorce papers organized, the keys on the table, and a small bill, without recriminations or lengthy explanations. He wasn't looking to heal wounds, he was looking to leave. Catherine reacted as always. Indignation, disbelief, the feeling of having been betrayed in her own narrative. For her, Raymond wasn't choosing to live, he was shattering the image, and that was unforgivable. He didn't wait for answers. He didn't want to witness the spectacle. He left before history could be rewritten at his expense. Raymond vanished without a sound. He changed countries, time zones, and pace of life. Lisbon welcomed him with a life that demanded nothing more than his presence. Long walks, simple coffees, the sound of the sea, true silence. No one there asked for explanations or comparisons. He didn't follow social media. He didn't seek to know what was being said about him. For the first time in decades, his life didn't need to be displayed to exist. His body began to respond. Less pressure in his chest, calmer breathing, full nights of sleep. It wasn't exaggerated happiness. It was something more basic and rarer. Peace. And Raymond understood that this, in itself, justified everything. Months later, a short message arrived on his phone. It wasn't filled with emotion, not even surprise. Catherine was getting married again. Quickly, at a vineyard in Napa, with impeccable production, like everything she touched. The name of her new fiancé wasn't unfamiliar. Kenneth Bradshaw, owner of car dealerships, a constant presence at high-profile events, with an easy smile and a success story that always seemed to move faster than expected. Raymond didn't feel jealousy or anger. He felt curiosity. It was the feeling of someone who has already stepped out of a movie and now watches the ending from the outside, with no need to intervene. He knew that these kinds of stories couldn't be sustained by image alone, but it was no longer his place to warn or correct. At that moment, as he reread the message, Raymond thought about how many people experience something similar without realizing it. Marriages that seem solid on the outside, but are empty on the inside. Decisions made based on appearances rather than substance. Perhaps that's why he decided to share his story, because if anyone is reading this far, they probably already felt that silent pressure, that constant need to hold on to something that only exists for others. If you can relate, leave a comment saying where you're reading from. Sometimes knowing we're not alone changes more than it seems. Raymond closed his phone and went back to his coffee. He no longer needed to be present in this new story to know how it might end. The news of the marriage didn't linger in Raymond's mind for sentimental reasons, but rather out of a cold, almost professional unease. Over the years, he'd learned to recognize patterns, especially when something grew too rapidly, with too much exposure and too little concrete data behind it. Kenneth Bradshaw fit that profile perfectly. Lots of image, lots of hype. Too many success stories repeated in social circles, but little verifiable information when you scratched the surface. Raymond didn't investigate immediately or make impulsive calls. He simply filed the information away in the part of his mind where he kept things that weren't urgent. But that shouldn't be ignored either. It wasn't his life, it wasn't his relationship, but he was still Jason's father, and that changed everything. Raymond knew that when people fall in love with a narrative, they tend to stop looking at the numbers. Meanwhile, Olivia had already begun doing what she did best, even before telling her father. As an investigative journalist, she had a finely tuned radar for inconsistencies, and Kenneth's name crossed her path almost by chance. Overly aggressive expansion, credit lines stretched to the limit, financial structures that seemed to rely more on refinancing than actual income, nothing yet exposed, nothing officially condemned, but enough red flags to raise serious suspicions. Olivia didn't act out of spite or blind loyalty to her father. She acted out of prevention. She knew her brother was being seduced by the image of the new perfect man, and that if something blew up, Jason would be too close to the harm. She decided to travel to Napa, not to celebrate, but to observe, protect, and if necessary, intervene. Jason met his father a few days before the trip to Napa. The conversation wasn't aggressive, but it was laced with thinly veiled recriminations. Jason spoke of opportunities, second chances, how his mother had finally found someone, her equal. Raymond listened more than he spoke. He recognized that tone. It wasn't certainty, it was a need to believe. When Raymond tried to point this out, not from a place of emotion, but using language Jason understood, reasons, exposure to risk, signs that didn't add up, the message was lost. Jason interpreted everything as resentment, as an attempt to sabotage a relationship he wanted to see work. For Jason, his father had abandoned his role as provider. For Raymond, leaving had been a matter of survival. Neither of them managed to make the other understand that at the time. The trip to Napa became a kind of confirmation ritual for Jason. Being there, being a godfather, being part of the spectacle, reinforced the narrative that the past had to be left behind. Olivia observed everything from a distance. She didn't confront, she didn't argue. She took note of gestures, conversations, awkward silences. She saw how her brother struggled to fit into this new family image, how he repeated phrases that didn't sound like his own. Raymond, from Lisbon, didn't follow anything in real time. He didn't follow social media. He didn't watch stories. He didn't look for additional information. He knew that interfering emotionally would only reinforce the idea that he was the villain of the piece. Sometimes, letting someone arrive at the truth on their own is the only way they'll truly see it. The wedding day was exactly as Catherine had always imagined, meticulously planned. Flawless in appearance, designed to be seen and remembered, the vineyard in Napa offered a setting straight out of a magazine, with perfect acoustics and an atmosphere carefully crafted to create a powerful impact. Nothing was there by chance. Every guest, every planned speech, every rehearsed gesture had a clear function within the narrative she wanted to maintain. Jason walked proudly, convinced he was witnessing a legitimate reenactment. Olivia sensed something else, a subtle tension, an exaggerated need for control, an urgency to convince everyone, even herself, that this story was solid. Sometimes, the more perfect a scene appears, the more fragile what lies beneath is. Clark Witherby was on the list like any other guest, an older man, quiet-looking with a kind face and the mannerisms of someone accustomed to observing more than speaking. No one questioned his presence. He seemed to fit in naturally among distant relatives and acquaintances from the social circle. Raymond had thought through every detail with emotional detachment and precision. He wasn't looking to humiliate or destroy. He wanted something simpler and at the same time deeper, to plant a seed of doubt impossible to ignore. The kind of doubt that can't be erased with a smile or a well-edited photo. Clark didn't carry documents. He didn't make direct accusations. He simply carried the quiet authority of someone who had seen too many similar stories end badly. And in an environment like that, set up. For applause and toasts, a single well-placed question could do more damage than any explicit scandal. When the time came for toasts, the atmosphere was already thick with anticipation. Jason was called first. He took the microphone with rehearsed confidence and spoke of second chances, of rebuilding, of learning to let go of what no longer serves a purpose. His words sounded right to someone who didn't know the whole story. At one point, he said something that cut through the air like a knife. He mentioned that it was time to forget the past, to not carry old mistakes, to look only forward. He didn't mention his father, but it wasn't necessary. The message was clear. For Jason, that speech was a declaration of maturity. For many, just a pretty phrase. For Raymond, who would hear it later from third parties, it would be confirmation that his departure had been interpreted as abandonment, not as a boundary. Olivia, present there, felt a physical discomfort. She knew that this attempt to erase the past didn't make it disappear. It only pushed it to another, more dangerous place. It was after that applause that Clark Witherby stood up. He walked slowly to the microphone with the naturalness of someone who doesn't seek the limelight. His voice was calm, almost affectionate. He began by speaking of experience, of the years that teach one to value real stability more than appearances. He mentioned Raymond as a man who, after a long time, had finally learned to breathe peacefully. No one immediately understood where he was going with this. Then came the questions, posed with the curiosity of an old man. How was it possible to grow so quickly without the numbers to match? How did certain expansions work? What kind of backing supported such ambitious loans? He didn't accuse, he didn't point fingers, he simply let the questions hang in the perfect air of the vineyard. He closed with a simple, almost gentle phrase, that sometimes in life solid ground is mistaken for beautifully decorated sand. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was heavy. The perfection had just cracked in public. The reaction was immediate, though no one raised their voice. Catherine lost control without any visible scene, which was how it always worked. Her face hardened, her gestures became mechanical, and the rest of the celebration continued by inertia, as if everyone were waiting for a sign to understand if it had been real. Hours later, far from the vineyard, Raymond's Phone rang in Lisbon. Catherine was shouting, accusing, saying that he had ruined her life, her image, her future. Raymond listened without interrupting. When she ran out of breath, he answered with a calmness that wasn't provocation, but distance. He told her that he hadn't orchestrated anything, that the problem was never him leaving, but her having built her life on a fragile facade, believing that appearance could replace substance. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He ended the call like someone who finally stops carrying a weight that isn't theirs. After that, everything moved quickly. The video of the toast appeared on social media, was shared, commented on, edited, transformed into a meme, and analyzed. Not because of the humiliation itself, but because it touched on something many people recognize: stories built on image, silences bought with luxury, truths no one wants to hear until someone speaks them aloud. If you're reading this far, you've probably seen something similar up close in your family, at work, or in your social circle. If you think this story could help someone, share it. Sometimes someone else's experience helps them open their eyes in time. Raymond didn't celebrate anything. He watched from afar as the perfect narrative unraveled on its own. In the following days, the consequences ceased to be mere noise on social media and began to carry real weight. Kenneth's name started appearing in connection with investigations, audits, and moves that had previously been buried under layers of marketing and connections. Banks reviewed lines of credit, partners distanced themselves, and journalists began to connect the dots that until then no one had any interest in exporting. What Clark had hinted at in the form of a question began to be confirmed with data. Nothing collapsed overnight, but the structure showed enough cracks for everyone to understand that this was not a passing crisis. Raymond followed everything with detachment, without satisfaction or guilt. There was no sense of poetic justice, only the certainty that poorly maintained truths always end up coming to light, with or without intervention. For Jason, the impact was direct and brutal. His name began circulating within the bank in uncomfortable conversations, not because of formal accusations, but by association. Having been a godfather, having publicly defended someone now under scrutiny, raised doubts about his judgment. Jason went from confidence to shame in a matter of weeks. That's when he called his father again, this time without a prepared speech. He spoke of fear, of guilt, of feeling used by a narrative he wanted to believe. Raymond didn't lecture, he listened. He explained with his usual calm that leaving wasn't an act of cowardice, but of survival. Jason apologized without drama. For the first time, he spoke to his father as a son, not as a judge. For Catherine, the downfall wasn't immediate, but it was steady. Doors that once opened easily began to close without lengthy explanations. Clients vanished, contacts stopped responding, invitations ceased. Her name became associated with the scandal, and in a market where image is everything, that carries more weight than any contract. She tried to maintain the victim narrative, but it no longer worked. Even her own children distanced themselves. Olivia was clear and firm. There would be no financial bailouts or attempts to whitewash a story that wasn't a one-off mistake, but a way of life. Catherine didn't just lose money or status. She lost the certainty that there would always be someone willing to hold her up when she decided not to look down. Raymond from Lisbon observed this process with a strange mix of relief and sobriety. He felt neither satisfaction nor a desire for revenge. He felt something simpler and more honest, gratitude for having gotten out in time. His health stabilized, medical appointments became routine, and the constant fear of collapsing faded away. He built a life without spectacle. He painted in the afternoons, walked aimlessly, and learned to enjoy conversations that demanded neither performance nor comparison. It was in this context that he met Isabel, a woman without haste, with no interest in the limelight or public validation. It wasn't an intense or cinematic love story. It was calm, mature, based on respect and genuine presence. And Raymond understood that this was precisely what had been missing for years. Over time, Jason began a slow and uncomfortable process of rebuilding. He went to therapy, re-evaluated past decisions, and learned to separate ambition from external validation. At the bank, he had to regain credibility from a more humble place, accepting limitations and questions he had previously avoided. Olivia continued to grow professionally, solidifying her reputation as someone who knows when to speak and when to wait. Her relationship with her father grew closer, not out of dependence, but out of mutual respect. Raymond didn't try to rewrite the past or demand belated recognition. For him, what was important had already happened. He had stopped living to uphold an image that didn't represent him, and had chosen, for the first time, a life with real substance. Today, when Raymond thinks about everything that happened, he doesn't do so with bitterness, nor with pride. He sees it as a clear line between two ways of being. On one side, a life built to be seen, applauded, and compared. On the other, a simple, quiet, and honest life that doesn't need constant witnesses to have value. He learned that peace isn't the absence of problems, but the absence of theatrics. That the body warns you when the mind has betrayed itself for too long. And that leaving isn't always running away. Sometimes it's the only act of responsibility someone can have toward themselves. Telling this story isn't about pointing fingers, but about remembering that no external recognition is worth more than remaining alive inside.